I think the worst thing that we could do to ourselves is become our own enemy. I don't think a lot of us realize how quick we become our own enemy because, we see people walking out of our life. We see people deciding to let us go. We see people having certain opinions about us, and it makes us kind of question, like, what's wrong with me? It must be something that I'm doing. I must not be enough. I must not be deserving of love. It must be something that I need to change. And it's so quick that we can become our own worst enemy and go down this spiral of negative self-talk, of, living in regret and things like that. And, I've been there. So my hope by the end of this video is to not only change the way in which you talk to yourself, but learn how to give yourself grace, even if you make mistakes, even if you are the person that's at fault, and not become your own worst enemy. I know at a period of time in my own life, like, I lived in a lot of regret. I saw myself lose a person that was very important to me, and I was so just upset with myself. And I wish I knew then what I had known in that moment. I had learned the lesson. I had learned from the situation what I should have done better or what I shouldn't have done at all. And it just made me live in regret. And I feel like a big part of my regret was, I wish I didn't make those mistakes with that person. And I wish I had made it with somebody I had cared less about. I always said that, some lessons will cost you the people that you love the most in order to learn them. Meaning that sometimes you have to lose certain people. Sometimes you have to damage something that's so valuable to you in order for it to actually get through your head. You see with some people, it's until they lose their jobs. It's until, something dangerous happens to a family member. It's until, they get impacted or hurt in life in a specific way that they finally learn the lesson that has always been there for them to learn, but, they were always ignorant to it or oblivious to it. And, for this video in particular, I'm not even saying that you're at fault, but I'm more so trying to talk to the people who are constantly living in regret, who are living in guilt for things that, again, may have been out of their control. I was talking with a client this past week, and we were talking about how, he was going down this rabbit hole of kind of wishing he could have done things better, or he was seeing patterns, or he was seeing where they were pulling away. And he was just constantly just beating himself up for, one, not walking away, not having that self-respect, not having, the confidence or the courage to maybe, speak up for himself, choose himself in that situation. And I had to check him. I had to be like, yo, you're beating yourself up for not being more of a people pleaser than you already were. Some of us, we don't realize that we're in relationships or we're dealing with people who, it makes us feel like we got to be somebody that we're not. We're constantly trying to be the right person for this person. We're constantly trying to, satisfy them. We're constantly making their happiness our responsibility. When in reality, like, majority, if not all of those things, aren't your responsibility at all. I would argue that you should want to be in relationships where they don't make you responsible for things that are their own responsibility. And so we see people walking in and out of our lives. We see ourselves losing certain people for, mistakes that, yeah, maybe we made mistakes. Maybe we could have done things better. But, we often just like get caught up in that guilt, and we end up just beating ourselves up for no apparent reason. We end up critiquing ourselves how we saw maybe how others critiqued us. Others constantly nitpicked at every decision we make or every wrong we did, or they constantly held on to, whatever mistakes we made. And there was no sense of grace. There was no sense of forgiveness. There was no sense of, hey, I'm willing to allow you to change. And I think we have to become that person for ourselves, because if we become our own worst enemy, you'll notice that, you'll ruin your own confidence. You'll ruin your own self-esteem. You'll form a negative perception around yourself of, oh, all I do is hurt people. All I do is mess up things. All I do is, everything that comes to me just ends up falling apart. I don't, I'm not deserving of good love, or I don't deserve good love. And it's like, when you become your own worst enemy, you attract the worst things in life. You only see the negatives in life. You only hold on to what you did in the past, and you never learn, who you want to be moving forward. I was a person, again, who used to hold on to that guilt, who used to hold on to my past mistakes and certain decisions I made. And I literally had to really just focus in on who I wanted to become moving forward, who I was now choosing to be. Because constantly hanging on to the past, constantly hanging on to, the decisions that were already made and I could no longer change, it was just a waste of time. I was doing nothing but drowning myself in my own regret, drowning myself in my own sadness. And at some point I had to realize, this is where I get to choose. This is where I get to learn. This is where I get to decide to never make this mistake again. And even though it might have costed me things, even though it might have costed me people, it was like, I had to come to acceptance with that. And I had to, almost see how God was using that situation or that person as a stepping stone into growth, into maturity, into, becoming more, aware and more willing to, gain that courage that I talked about earlier, about having that self-respect, or just like, developing that self-love, developing those boundaries and things like that, so that, I never got into a relationship that looked like that past relationship or looked like that past friendship. And real quick, if you feel like you're currently in a season of your life where you're struggling with your self-talk and, showing yourself grace and allowing yourself the space to grow and learn from your mistakes, be sure to check out my one-on-one coaching down below in the description, as it might be something that's for you. But anyways, back to the video. I feel like a lot of times the people who are usually the hardest on themselves are usually like people pleasers, because I feel like we often understand, or, I'm speaking in past tense for myself of who I used to be, but I feel like when you're a person who is like your worst critic, or you're holding on to your mistakes and you're holding on to regret and things like that, you understand how it makes you feel, because you probably internalize a lot of people's opinions and a lot of results you get, and you allow it to like put limitations on you, and it makes you question who you are and, what you're capable of, what you can and can't do in life, what you do and don't deserve, and just going down that whole, just kind of rabbit hole of just regret and negative thoughts. Like, I feel like when we understand how that affects us, we don't want to dish that out onto other people. So, we don't check people. We don't tell them how we feel and maybe where they need to make changes and things like that, because we don't want to make it seem like we're being mean to them, or, we don't want to make our criticism seem like we're trying to, shame them in some type of way or talk negatively about them. And so we tend to just hold back, because we know how it feels to receive all of those things, or maybe, receive that judgment, or receive people making us feel bad about our mistakes, or, making us feel bad about, where we fall short of other people's standards or the expectation or whatever. And so we tend to just try not to dish that out on other people. But in reality, we just end up, again, people pleasing, kind of looking for their validation, kind of playing life safe, not sticking up for ourselves, not showing up for ourselves, and making them the priority instead of ourselves. But then it's like internally, we're criticizing ourselves how they tend to criticize us, because they tend to have that conditional love. They tend to hold on to our mistakes. They tend to hold on to, the moments where we fail or whatever. And so then we just tend to do that for ourselves. So every mistake we make, every time something falls apart, every time something doesn't go our way, we automatically look internally and we're like, what did I do wrong? What's wrong with me? What do I need to change? And that's not always the worst mindset to have, but I think a lot of times we do it in a negative way rather than a critiquing way of, how can I grow from this? How can I use this as reflection and, let myself know how I could go about it better? But then again, a lot of times we're blaming ourselves for things that were never our responsibility in the first place, that weren't in our control. We look at people deciding about not value us. We look at people walk out of our lives. We look at people deciding that, hey, they want to go out and do their own thing and they no longer want us to be a part of their life. And we're automatically like, what's wrong with me? How about what's wrong with them? Because I've had to learn that some people don't even have the emotional maturity. Some people don't even have the emotional capacity to be able to handle you as a person. Because some people don't want to change. Some people don't care to hear constructive criticism. Some people don't care to, take responsibility. And so when they get in a relationship with you or a friendship with you and you challenge those things, or you call certain things out, and they see like, dang, they making me have to be more intentional about the decisions I make. They're making me have to consider them and stuff like that. Like, some people don't have the capacity emotionally to want to do those things. And so they decide to walk away. But again, that's nothing that's your fault. It's more so a problem and an issue within themselves of what they've made space for, where their emotional maturity is and, the type of person that they are. But then again, we look at things falling apart and we automatically assume, oh, we're to blame, because everybody around us has always blamed us for, when things go wrong or when we make mistakes, and, made it seem like it was a burden that we had to carry rather than something that we would be able to grow from and not have to allow it to define ourselves as it. A lot of times we look at our mistakes, we look at our failures, and we allow those moments to define us. We allow those moments to say, I must be this person. I must not deserve this. I must not deserve that. When in reality, it's like, none of these things define us. They're just a moment in time that we get to learn from and use as, you know, a moment to reflect on and a moment to grow from. Which kind of takes me into my self-talk portion of the video of just like, you have to literally become your own best friend. You got to literally become like your own parent. Like, I like to picture myself, because I talk to myself a lot, especially in my writing, where I have to reassure myself a lot. You know, sometimes I got to reassure myself of who I am, the worth that I hold. Sometimes I get caught up in comparison, and it makes me lose track of my own value and just the value of where I already am. And it's like, sometimes you got to become your own parent. You know, you got to envision yourself as like your own child. Like, how would I talk to my child? How would I talk to a little kid that, you know, was in a situation like me, where they're constantly holding on to guilt, or they're holding on to shame, or they're just holding on to, you know, their mistake and their failure or whatever. And I had to like literally become that person before myself. I had to literally learn how to, you know, completely reconstruct the way I talk to myself, because at a point in time, my self-talk was so negative, and it was so like beating myself up every time things went wrong. But now I'm in a position where it's like, my self-talk is so highly of myself, because I constantly am just reassuring myself. I'm constantly like thinking positively. I'm constantly like allowing myself to fail, allowing myself to make mistakes, and knowing that it's okay, knowing that it's not a moment that defines me, and it's a moment that I can grow from and just do better moving forward. Because again, holding on to the past does nothing for your future. If anything, it just makes the future negative. It takes you away from the present moment, and it takes you away from being able to grow from situations and get new results for yourself. Because I remember reading a book called The Power of the Subconscious Mind, and it basically just told about like, whatever opinion you have of yourself, whatever thoughts you have about yourself, are always going to be true. So if you believe you're not good enough, if you think you are not capable, if you think you can't do something, you're 100% correct. But if you believe that you can, if you believe in yourself, if you think highly of yourself, you're also correct. You have to understand that your mind doesn't like decipher between positive, negative thoughts or positive and negative beliefs. It literally just deciphers from, you know, whatever you feed it. So if you feed it positive thoughts, it will believe positive thoughts. It will generate positive thoughts. But if you feed it negative thoughts, it will also act in alignment with those negative thoughts. So if I believe I'm not confident, if I believe I'm ugly, if I believe I'm not good enough, if I believe I can't do something, my approach towards things that I believe I can't do, my approach towards, you know, let's just say trying to get a girl or whatever, and I have the belief that I'm ugly, will cause a sense of anxiety. It will cause a sense of fear. It will cause a sense of resistance, because it's going away from the identity or the beliefs I hold about myself. But if I think, oh, I'm attractive, oh, there's value outside of just my looks, or, you know, this was just a mistake and I can learn from it, or, you know, I can do this, I just need to be willing to figure it out, then, you know, you have a different level of confidence. You have a different level of calmness. You have a different level of, you know, being willing to actually step into that space. But it's all because of, you know, the inner dialogue you change towards yourself. And so what I really want you to take away from this video is just like, give yourself the same grace that you give to others. You know, the excuses you make for other people, the reasoning you give to other people about why they are the way that they are, where they are, you know, the grace you give to them, and, you know, the space you make for their mistakes and stuff like that. Like, give that same stuff to yourself, because again, you have to become your best friend, because you're the only person you're ever going to always have. And, you know, people are going to constantly come and go, and you can't allow those moments to, you know, define the perception or the belief that you hold about yourself, or the opinion about yourself. Because every time you see something negative happen, you can't develop a negative belief about who you are and automatically make yourself responsible for, again, something that is completely out of your control and not your responsibility to handle. But, you know, I love and appreciate you guys as always. Be sure to check out my one-on-one coaching down below in the description. I'm gonna catch you guys in the next video. Peace.